Originally released in 1992, Alone in the Dark was a trailblazer for the industry, incorporating survival horror and 3D together for the first time, balancing a sense of puzzle solving, inventory management, and action in a spooky scary setting of a mansion. Well, nowadays these sound like the norm in video games. This is something not yet seen in a 3D survival horror game. In fact, back then, the term survival horror was not actually coined. Instead, the term became more mainstream and widely used upon the release of the original Resident Evil, which is often hailed as the game that solidified survival horror in the video game industry. A game that actually took inspiration from Alone in the Dark, with the video game director Shinji Mikami deciding to utilise the same third-person cinematic shots for use in their game, rather than the intended first-person shooter concept originally envisioned. Alone in the Dark, as well as another game known as Sweet Home, laid the foundations of what would become the staples of survival horror games. Alone in the Dark's importance to the video game industry as a whole cannot be understated, despite the clunky looking graphics. Alone in the Dark features two characters to choose from, the first of which being Emily Hartwood, the niece of Jeremy Hartwood, who is the owner of the mansion that acts as the main setting of the game, the Deserto. The second playable character that can be chosen is Edward Carnby, a private investigator who later becomes the main protagonist of the franchise, appearing in every single one of the games as a main character. Regardless of which character is chosen, there is no difference in the gameplay or plot aside from the backstory on why Emily and Edward have arrived at the mansion. Both are completely equal and no difference is made to the main gameplay of the game. For Emily, she's chosen to return to the mansion in order to look into her Uncle Jeremy's suicide, enlisting to search his piano's secret compartment for clues, whereas for Edward, he arrives at the mansion in order to pillage the piano and bring it back to an antique dealer for payment. With either of the characters chosen, the player arrives at the mansion before the door slams shut behind them, trapping them inside and beginning the game, as they travel through the quiet and eerie abode of Jeremy Hartwood, before reaching the loft of the property where the game officially begins. Inside the loft of the Deserto, the player has a short time to familiarise themselves with the controls of the game, and boy is it a doozy to figure out. For the character, movement is done through tank controls, much akin to Alone in the Dark survival horror descendant Resident Evil, which makes moving a little bit awkward, especially with the different camera angles. But since I grew up with games like this and Grim Fandango, I'm a certified pro at manoeuvring shitey controls, and I don't consider that to be the main problem with the game. What is a bit more difficult is learning how to interact with the environment. By accessing a menu with their inventory, there are several actions that Emily or Edward can select that will affect how they act, such as how they push, open, or search containers, or even how to fight, which is about to become incredibly important. After all, when I said that the game provides the player with a short time to familiarise themselves with the controls, I really did mean a short time. Because after a minute of in-game time passes, the first enemy of Alone in the Dark bursts through the window, bouncing towards the player. This asshole right here is what the creators refer to as a demon chicken, and is fully prepared to peck the player to death if they don't fight back. But this does give us the opportunity to hone our combat skills. With combat, you need to hold down the action button, and your attacks will correspond to which directional button you press, such as the left keyboard button being a left hook, the right keyboard button being a right hook, and the back button being a more distant kicking attack. And as you can imagine, it's a bit difficult to get to grips with this, as it requires a lot of timing or ability to get the enemy in a corner so you can continuously pound them without falling backwards out of reach. Now, if you thought that was an ordeal, then you're in for a treat, as yet another enemy bursts in through a nearby trapdoor. The zombie, which, compared to the demon chicken, is much more lenient and an easier enemy, being less fast and thus easier to fight. And once defeated, both foes disappear in a plume of smoke and the loft becomes a safe haven for the rest of the game. But there is something really neat about Alone in the Dark, in that the player has the ability to outright circumvent these two fights completely, and it's hinted at slightly in Emily's introduction, where she mentions the bizarre behaviour of her Uncle Jeremy, moving the wardrobe in front of the window. Now, it turns out that old Jerry was onto something here, because by selecting push in the command window, the player can move the wardrobe in front of the window to block our demonic chicken foe from bursting through and avoiding that particular fight. And what of the nosy zombie friend poking his head through the attic door? Well, sure, we can certainly open up that tantalising nearby chest and use the rifle inside to blow his head off, but in order to save ammunition, the player can also push the chest on top of the attic door, blocking access from down below and making the attic safe for Emily and Edward. There are a few moments like this where combat can be avoided, but there is no sidling away from combat throughout the rest of the game. In the end, thinking is for dorks. Real men and women put up their dukes and fight away their problems. Descending further down into the mansion, the player finds many fiendish traps lying in wait for them, much like in a point-and-click adventure game of the era. Alone in the Dark is filled with many pitfalls to ensnare the player if they're not cautious. Now, one example is this massive ominous looking piece of flooring in the third floor corridor, which clearly screams death trap, and if trod upon, will collapse, resulting in a game over. So of course, it's very important to make sure you save your damn game, because it's very, very easy to slip up with Alone in the Dark's many different ways of dying. And it's also very important to remember to make multiple saves, because much like a Sierra game, there are dead ends lying in wait, looking to absolutely scunner the player's day. Alone in the Dark also features its fair share of horror, such as in the study, where the door closes on the player and if they reopen it, they'll find themselves cornered by a zombie, and they will need to fight for their lives, no doubt using a nearby sword from a chest. Although the problem with that was that in my excitement to learn how to swing a sword, I accidentally used it a little too much in my practicing, and it broke. Yeah, this sword sucks. Without really having a grasp on the controls and fighting, poor Emily was wiped out in the end and dragged down below onto some weird sacrificial altar, ending the game. So instead, I reattempted, but this time went with Edward, choosing to explore the mansion as the private detective instead, using the knowledge I had learned already to make things a bit easier, and even gaining access to the secret drawer of the piano mentioned in Emily's introduction to find Jeremy Hartwood's suicide note, claiming that hellish forces have been unleashed and that they won't be able to claim his body, which certainly sounds like the ramblings of a poor mentally ill man, but with the recent exposure to monsters, I'm beginning to think he was probably the most knowledgeable man out of all of us. Sometimes these monsters chance upon the player when they're not looking, slowly walking into the room, but usually the game is kind enough to tell the player that something is amiss by a frantic OST. And sometimes the monsters are just spawned by certain actions such as picking up a vase in another room. With such threats, it's important that the player take ideal care of their health, which can be monitored in the menu, because to the surprise of absolutely no one, the game is over once the number reaches 0. It's also important for the player to keep an eye out for items that raise their health, like medkits that contain flasks of medicine, or even biscuits that restore health. But unlike most survival horrors, it's actually detrimental to save these up, and instead the player should consume them immediately, as there's no maximum health point limit, and saving them only serves to clutter the inventory and cause further issues down the line. While the first few rooms are linear and explorable, the rest of the house is blocked, as at the top of the stairwell are two demons that won't let the player pass by easily, leading into Alone in the Dark's focus on the puzzle side of the game, because as loathsome as I am to admit it, swinging wildly at the enemy just doesn't work all the time, such as at this moment. Both stairwells are blocked by them standing there, menacingly, and they will attack when the player gets too close for comfort. Of course, that didn't deter my Edward, who proceeded to unleash a can of whoop-ass on some demonic tush. But this is completely inadvisable because these demons are both indestructible and cannot be bested in combat. The secret to beating them is in fact by reading, because knowing is half the battle. In some nearby books are some literature detailing information about the demons and how they can be defeated through gathering two mirrors that are locked away in the bedroom. But these indestructible demons early at this point of the game are only part of the deviousness of Alone in the Dark. Earlier I mentioned dead ends in video games, and this actually happens to be one of the first ones the player comes across. For the mirrors in the player's inventory, if they are so much as hit by an enemy, then they'll hear a shattering noise and the mirrors will become broken. And while not being outright explained, this makes the game unwinnable, and the player will need to reload an earlier save if they wish to bypass the demons and complete the game. Otherwise, they can certainly just go hermit mode and live in the loft, I guess, until starvation takes its toll. Instead, the player can place both mirrors on nearby statues, which causes the demons to flail around frantically, and once both are placed, they scream and dissolve away. With a pretty feeble scream that sounds like they decided to push Josh the Payroll Accountant down a flight of stairs, record it, and call it a day. With the demons out of the way, the house becomes more accessible, and the game becomes less linear, with different routes for the player to explore throughout the large mansion. Although, for whatever reason, whichever Looney Tunes character is hiding in the library blocks it so that the player cannot access it for now. These previous encounters show that there is a large amount of peril in the house, and there is a significant amount of dangerous enemies lurking, such as the bottom of the stairs outside the library. Here resides a large suit of armour that is chill to let them pass by, but freaks the fuck out when touched and begins swinging its sword. In fact, there's quite a few enemies like this in the game. Not too far away in the living room is a ghostly shade who sits quite contentedly in silence and won't cause any harm to the player as long as they don't touch it. But if they so much as bump into the ghost, then they stand up and turn into a collection of orbs that just make a genuinely terrifying noise before following the player and hunting them down to kill them in one singular hit. There's plenty in this game capable of annihilating the player in one hit if they're not careful. Heck, even the front door of the house will kill you if you even attempt to open it, as the player is sucked into whatever dimension the mansion is now situated in. Which means there is a lot of trial and error when it comes to exploring through the house in order to find out what happened to poor Jeremy Hartwood and how to escape from this manor, even when facing off against such dreadful odds, such as impossible to kill enemies, such as this purple tentacle creature lurking in the bathroom. Now, where have I seen this before? In doing so, a lot of the backstory can be found, told through letters and books that are scattered among the mansion, such as Jeremy's notebook, which explains more of what's been going on, as he's become beguiled by horrible visions and of a man who is looking to possess Jeremy, and he decides to prevent this by ultimately killing himself. At times there are also rooms where the room is completely black and you are alone. If only there was a term we could use to describe this. How about loneliness in the pitch black? In order to safely travel through these rooms and, not getting by Gru or anything, The player can use a lantern, which uses a finite amount of oil as a resource that can run out if the player isn't careful. But as long as it's tip-topped up with some oil, the lantern can be used to light up the room, being carried by the player, or being set down on the floor to illuminate the rest of the room. In one of the hallways leading to other accessible ends of the library is a corridor with paintings of Native American men. Now, of course, this being a batshit crazy game, it decided to throw a homing tomahawk at the player that is capable of turning corners and hitting the player, likely killing them. And if that wasn't bad enough, the other side has yet another homicidal painting, this time firing an arrow at the player, which is sure to do some damage, making it not quite simple enough to pass through unharmed without taking the correct precautions. And also further down the hallways is just a casual murderous pirate roaming around, which, much like all pirates back in the day, is completely impervious to bullets, and it means that combat is absolutely necessary to proceed, although inadvisable at this point without the player arming themselves properly, because a butter knife is just not going to cut it. Literally. And despite its clunkiness, combat is a large part of the game, such as walking into a dining room and being attacked by several zombies, who are kind enough to approach one at a time, which gives some proper opportunity to go all Kenshiro Fist of the North Star on them. But like the loft enemies, this can also be avoided by serving dinner. In the kitchen is a heavy pot of soup, made entirely out of human meat that, if placed on the dining table, completely satiates the appetite of the zombies and lets the character move through the room unharmed, and letting them enter a ghostly smoke room where the player can snag a lighter, which is very, very important for the late game. Now, sure, while the mansion is for all means and purposes what one can consider a god-awful hell trap intent on murdering everyone living, there's also a bunch of goodies for the player to snag if they know where to look, such as in the kitchen where a revolver can be found hidden inside a shoebox and some coal, and again, becomes a pretty helpful weapon towards the end of the game particularly. There is one particular room that caused me a huge amount of grief, and that was the statue room. Found embedded in the statue are several arrows that the player absolutely needs to gather in order to proceed in the game. But I didn't realise when I attempted to pick them up, my inventory was full, and I failed to gather them. You see, Alone in the Dark has an encumbering system for when the player has too many items in their inventory, with heavier items taking up the brunt of it. And at this point in the game, I was gathering all sorts of items such as books filled with lore without even considering dropping any of them. This is why it's important for the player to drop books when they're finished, and even consume healing items immediately, as it serves just to wave the player down. But here's the kicker. When the player interacts with the arrows, down come some murderous ass spiders, hell-bent on making things difficult, and pretty much blocking the room off for the rest of the game, because these little bastards are invincible, and make even walking back into the room impossible. Now, why is this an issue? Well, earlier I mentioned the corridor of the Native American paintings that unleash attacks on the player, and it's with these arrows that the player is able to get rid of the painting on the other side of the hall to prevent it from impaling them with their own arrows. Now, what exactly did this mean? Well, I guess I found a dead man walking scenario, and unfortunately I'd been saving over some of the older files thinking I was safe, so that meant I had to restart the entire game from scratch again. So once more, I went back to the start of the game, once again playing as Emily, armed with even more knowledge than my previous encounters, including knowing to throw a heavy statuette from one of the dark rooms at the suit of armour in the lobby, killing what is an otherwise invincible foe and pilfering its sword from it. And it's just as well that I did, because this sword happens to be probably the best weapon in the game. In fact, I didn't even use any of my firearms once I picked it up, since all I needed in the end was to study the blade. And it's also handy because it certainly made the fight with the angry pirate all the more easier, challenging him to a sword fight before he disappears in smoke and leaves behind a key to unlock the ballroom. Inside the ballroom is a key that can be easily missed if it's not snagged before a certain part of the game, making this yet another looming dead end. The key is hung up on a mantelpiece, blocked by 3 dancing groups of ghosts who stand still in front of it. Much like our ghost friend from the living room, they very much appreciate their personal space, and if the character touches them, they'll turn into the unimaginable source of bubbles that will stalk the player and kill them in one hit, meaning that the only way to get past them is by playing their preferred music. But much like jaded metalheads, they'll turn their nose up at anything that they don't consider to be to their liking. With a gramophone from the lounge and a specific record played, they begin to dance around the room, meaning the player can snag the key, but they still need to dodge around the dancers, as they will still kill them if they happen to bump into them. The library is another location that is incredibly dangerous. After all, they say that the most deadly enemy is one who has vast amounts of knowledge, but I mean, if I were to guess, I would also consider the big angry invincible ghost wandering around to also be a threat too, I suppose, with none of the player's weapons damaging it as it slowly stalks them through the main library. The player needs to run around this library looking for a place they can insert a fake book, opening a secret passageway like this is Scooby-Doo, and taking them into a hidden chamber where yet another endgame item lies. The talisman. The library is also a vast source of information, providing more backstory information such as about the mansion and its occupiers, while also providing hints such as which of 3 weapons hidden in the room can vanquish the purple ghost, referred to as a god known as the Vagabond. Now sure, while these books are a great source of information, some of the knowledge contained in these books are capable of causing serious harm, with some of the content outright killing the player if they even dare read it without the protection of a pentagram in the hidden room. At this point in the game, we've explored nearly all of the interior of the house, although with a few rooms unexplored. One example is the basement, which isn't very important, at least not in this version of the game. In fact, it only really contains a bunch of rats and some ammo.
Rats, where the rats?
But hidden behind some crates is an entrance to some horrendous cave blocked by a giant, murderous worm known as Kyphorian that is capable of chomping down on the player and killing them, meaning it's not very worthwhile to explore. In fact, there is no real reason to explore it at this point. But allegedly in other versions of the game, it's necessary to unblock this, or it causes a very heinous dead end for the player. Another location is locked away, but it can be unlocked with a key found in a bedroom at the end of the murderous Native American hallway, and this room is Jeremy's study, which is very important. Inside is a shield with one sword, and when the sword originally picked up near the start of the game is placed, it opens a secret passageway into the depths of the mansion, leading into the endgame of Alone in the Dark. That's right, the sword from the start of the game that I wound up breaking at the start of the game. To give the game credit, this isn't an issue of a dead end, meaning that even if the sword is broken, it fortunately can still be used to access the depths, but in its place is another dead end. You see, this stairway acts as a point of no return, a checkpoint in the game where if the player passes by it, there is no going back. But fiendishly, the game doesn't tell you this, and if you haven't gotten everything you need by the time you descend into the depths, then your game is unwinnable. And in a very cruel fashion, you won't even know this until you explore further into the depths of the mansion and get further towards the end of the game. These depths are also riddled with death. In fact, upon entering, there's a rickety bridge that, once stood on, will collapse, killing the player unless they run across. But as long as they do, they reach the same system of catacombs they found in the basement, including Slurms Mackenzie himself, who shows up to chase the player. In the process of the chase, the giant worm slams into a closed passageway, which clears the way and leads into the water-filled underground, filled with mini Godzillas over here called the Deep Ones, that lurk in the water, which are most certainly dangerous, as well as hosting some other truly murderous creatures, such as this giant rat spider monstrosity.
I'm the giant rat that makes all of the rules.
But what is very dangerous here are the pitfalls on the way that act as steps towards reaching a dead end, such as when trying to cross over this bridge, which collapses and sends the player into the water. And when this happens, it actually causes several things to all go wrong at once. For one thing, the rifle cartridges on their person get completely soaked and thus ruined, making the rifle completely unusable. So if you've been saving up your ammunition like a good little survivor horror player, then you're out of luck. The rifle cannot be used ever again. But the worst part is that the lamp also goes out and the matches to light it are completely ruined, making the game unwinnable unless the player managed to snag a lighter up top floor before they descended into these depths. There also comes moments where there are pillars sitting ominously that look to be platforms across. Now, of course at this point I knew there was no option for jumping and I resigned to my fate of just plummeting down, but it turns out there is actually a means of jumping which isn't really shown to the player. In order to jump, the player actually gains a new action once they reach the underground, featured alongside their other action commands. This one being to jump, allowing the player to jump across gaps, which is important when trying to explore this hellspawn of a room where it's really hard to tell where anything is due to the horrors of depth perception. After finally managing to reach the other end, the player reaches a locked chest. Now in order to open this, the player needs the key from the ballroom, because without it, they can't open the chest to receive a gem needed to reach the end of the game, meaning, whoops, it's another dead end. Inside the chest, the player also receives the memoirs of Trizikio, the pirate frequently mentioned throughout the lore of the game. The memoirs act as a threat to the player, revealing that he is the mastermind behind the events of the mansion. But he is currently immobilized in the depths of the mansion and is now awaiting the player so that they can possess them in place of the now deceased Jeremy, so he can lead an age of nightmares across the world, which also explains the game over screen, with the player characters left on the altar for Trizikio to take them over. After passing through, the player also needs to explore a pitch dark maze, which is pretty much impossible without using the lighter to light the lantern and show the way. But once they reach the end, they need to use the gem to enter the next chambers where Trizikio awaits, having become a huge giant tree. Now, sure, a tree might not seem menacing, but it sure is when it summons deep ones and shoots fireballs at the player. In order to weaken the tree Trizikio, which we will henceforth now refer to as Trizikio, the player needs to have the talisman from the library, or they cannot proceed, making yet another devious dead end. And even if the player somehow managed to make it through the maze without a source of light, they are still royally boned if they don't have the ability to light the lantern. After all, fire is perhaps a tree's greatest weakness, and without a lit lantern to throw at the tree, there is no means on defeating it, resulting in yet another dead end. But If the player has played it safe and came prepared with a lit lantern and the talisman, the player can throw the lantern at the tree, setting it ablaze and removing Trizikio from this plane once and for all. With his power destroyed, the interior of the catacombs begin to crumble as the player looks to escape. Fortunately, this is made all the more easier now that the pirate's spirit is gone, as all the monsters of the mansion have also vanished, allowing the player to return back to the manor through the no longer guarded basement exit. And with Trizikio's influence gone, the front door no longer looks to murderalise the player, allowing them to safely exit the horrors of the mansion and to return back to civilization as they hitch a ride, which just so happens to be driven by a zombie. Oh dear. But with that, the player has successfully managed to rid the world of the dreaded pirate Trizikio and escape the horrors of the Deserto Manor. Want to make sure you don't miss out on the video for Alone in the Dark 2? Then make sure you don't forget to subscribe to Noir Reservoir and click the little bell down there to be kept up to date with all future Noir Reservoir videos. And if you want to help support the channel, please consider liking the video and sharing it with any survival horror aficionados you think will appreciate it. And finally, why not consider following me on some of my other platforms? You can find me on my Twitter, Tumblr, or even my own Discord server for all the dank memes. I'm sure you won't regret it. Probably. So until next time, my friends, I'll catch you later.